Hey, Drew here. Did you have a nice holiday? I had a nice holiday, which is why I am a little behind on videos, obviously. I was gonna put this review of the second episode of The Stand in a combined video with the third episode when it comes out on Thursday, but I decided that there was just a lot here to unpack and I had too many thoughts and I didn't really want to combine them in one video, so I decided to go ahead and put out this video, even though it's very late. So if you're watching this, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Basically, at this point, I would say that if I was a Rotten Tomatoes critic, I would give this show a rotten, even though I am enjoying the ride. Primarily because even though you can sense that CBS All Access senses the potential for a hit with this show, the potential for it to be a cultural touchstone, and make no mistake, Stephen King's novel was a huge cultural touchstone for many and remains so. The execution of this is just kind of shoddy. Like, they've funneled a lot of resources into it, clearly, but production values aside, I just don't think they've put enough thought into how to accurately portray the landscape and the characters of this post-apocalyptic America. And there's a number of ways that this breaks down for me, but I'll get into that in a second. This episode focuses on the character of Larry Underwood, played capably by Jovan Adepo, and obviously to a lot of viewers, he's a relatively fresh face. Some of you might recognize him from Watchmen, where he played an Emmy-nominated role. And he's been in a number of films and TV series. He's an up-and-comer, and he is great here. I really did admire his performance. I feel that he added a lot of nuance to what could essentially be described as a little bit of a cliched character, because he's playing this character who is a musician who has substance abuse issues and finds himself landed in the middle of this post-pandemic landscape. And, you know, like I said, I think he adds nuance to what is essentially a rather cliched character. But I feel that this episode on the whole just feels rushed. I think that's the main problem with this series as a whole, is there's just too much to this book to do, even in 9 episodes, and it shows, even with some of the decisions they've made. Now, I really, really do not like the decision to have the moving around in time. I think they should have just told this story sequentially, and this episode, some of the effects of this decision to not tell the story sequentially become even more obvious. I feel particularly in the scenes with the character of Nadine Cross, played by Amber Heard, because the episode starts with them arriving at the Colorado Free Zone, and the character that she plays, you would think that at some point she would show up, the meeting between her character and Larry would be portrayed at some point during this episode, because we're seeing them already, in an established relationship. We don't really know what it is. Are they lovers? Are they just people that are on a journey together? We don't really know, because the episode doesn't bother to tell us. But they act as though we should know, because there's these scenes between these characters where you can tell that there's like shared history, but we don't know what that shared history is. And I'm going to say something controversial that will probably tick some of you purists off, but I'm not here to say, oh, the show has to be exactly like the book. Adaptational changes have to happen. And I'm reviewing the show. I'm not reviewing the book. Now, clearly, if you are a fan of the book, you probably feel pretty shortchanged at every turn by this show. But if you just came in looking for an apocalyptic show, you probably won't know why people are getting really testy about a lot of this stuff. But this episode, to me, I feel like might have been more advisable to cut Heather Graham's character, even though I would really rather spend time with Heather Graham than Amber Heard, and maybe introduce Amber Heard's character more quickly, or just make the character played by Amber Heard a composite of the two characters, because I don't think that they have enough time to develop Heather Graham and Amber Heard in this show. I think that they have to have one character or the other, because we're not really getting to know either at this point. Now, that's what I would say, and again, I expect this to be a controversial opinion, but That's what I think they should have done. This episode, you see things breaking down a little bit more even than we got to see in the first episode. But I have to say, despite the fact that this is a very, very R-rated show, I mean, there's a lot of very, very gratuitous gore and F-words, which doesn't bother me a bit, but I'm just pointing out, like, it isn't TV PG as someone erroneously stated that it was on Amazon Video. But I have to point out, it just feels like a very sanitized, almost PG-13 landscape to me. And drawing a comparison with The Walking Dead, which is a show that I don't love and that I could point out has a lot of flaws, but drawing a comparison to that show, even at the beginning, I just felt that that show did a better job portraying how chaotic, dilapidated, and just run down society would be given this kind of apocalyptic event. And this series, to me, it just doesn't feel as if the characters are in an apocalyptic landscape. Like, there's a scene at the beginning of this episode where they show Larry going into this supermarket, taking a gas tank, going to one of the grills on display and just starting to cook up some food. And, this is kind of an interesting scene, kind of showing how society's fallen apart and you can just go and take whatever you want and whatever you need. I feel like, to be a little bit facetious, Last Man on Earth with Will Forte did these kinds of scenes better in its pilot episode. If you haven't seen that show, I highly recommend at least the first 2 seasons. But here, I feel like this just feels like the employees didn't come into work for the day. Like, the place doesn't seem run down at all. It doesn't seem like there's, rotting and decaying food. You don't see dead people strewn across the floor. It doesn't really seem as though they put in the effort to make this seem like a rundown supermarket. And granted, maybe it wouldn't be that rundown at this point, but I'm sure it would be more rundown than this. And it just doesn't do much to establish the world when they don't show it being more rundown. And just generally, I don't feel like this show does a great job capturing how chaotic things would be. An example of this, there's a scene in this episode where Larry encounters this old man, and the man is supposedly has escaped from a local hospital where he was having a stent put in, and he's just walking around in a hospital gown that exposes his backside. And Larry's kind of like, put on some clothes, man. And the guy's like, I'm gonna go live out my lifelong dream of streaking and committing a publicly indecent act in the baseball stadium nearby because society has broken down and the first thing I want to do is just take advantage of my newfound freedom. And this is all okay. I mean, it's a little on the nose, but it's kind of establishing, we no longer have society to tell us what to do. Isn't that freeing? So, it's kind of fitting with the themes of King's book, and it's an interesting thing to explore. Then there's the sound of gunfire in the distance, and the man lurches forward as if he's been shot, but then he jumps up and scrambles away, apparently unharmed, and you see that he's just, frightened by the sound of gunshots in the distance. And this is kind of, again, heavy-handed, maybe a little bit on the nose, but it's establishing pretty well, showing the viewer that even though, at first your reaction might be, great, we have freedom now, the freedom comes at a cost because you're no longer afforded the protection that society provides. But the next shot is of Larry just, ambling along, not at all seemingly concerned by the gunfire in the distance, and it just completely undercuts the previous moment. And I feel like there's a lot of examples in this episode where people just don't act like they're in danger. There's a scene where Larry has someone pointing a gun at him, and his behavior in this scene just did not strike me. It did not ring true. And I blame the writers. I don't blame the actors. I think that they should have done more to show the dread and the fear and the concern that these characters are feeling. It comes across sometimes, but it feels like isolated moments rather than, a constant tension that I think would be the case in an actual situation like this. A lot of the efforts to kind of portray the depravity and the danger of this situation just fell flat on other levels. For instance, the scene where Larry is wandering the city with Heather Graham's character and they encounter this guy in a suit who really, I feel, would not be wearing a suit, A, and B, would look a lot more disheveled. And he offers them $1 million for, time with Heather Graham's character. And of course, This scene, it's kind of good because it establishes money really doesn't have any value in the new society, but even despite that, you see Larry considering, or seeming, that's what I interpreted him to be doing, considering the offer because, I mean, in your head, it's still money. It's hard to realize that it has no value anymore. But then these random guys show up and chase them down into the sewers. And my question was, so why are these guys following this other guy? And was the plan always for him to pay $1 million for them to all have access to her? Like, the thing makes no sense. And also why these guys would be with him in this landscape just looking for random women to rape. I mean, that just doesn't seem particularly plausible. But again, this is one of those things that because everything's happening so quickly, I think that maybe they could have explained this, fleshed it out a bit more if they had taken their time, but everything has to be rushed because of the needs of the story. Now, the scenes in the sewer, they were kind of horror-esque. I think that the scenes were definitely more frightening in the book. People who like horror, I am not among them personally, but if something has a good plot, I'll be invested regardless of whether it's in that genre. But these scenes to me, there was moments that I think will appeal to horror fans, but overall the execution was just average. Nothing too particularly special. I did think the visual of the rats coming out of Larry's mother's mouth was probably the strongest one. But then the writing just, there was so much laziness to this writing. So he comes up out of the sewer at a random spot after he starts having all these visions and thinks he's getting attacked by rats. And he happens to come up at the exact spot where Heather Graham's character has wandered, just randomly wandering north without any kind of GPS. It makes no sense that they would stumble upon each other. It's a huge, huge city. It's just staggeringly implausible. We got to see a little bit more of Randall Flagg this episode. I have to say, I've seen some people commenting that Alexander Skarsgard is wooden. I did not think that was the case this episode. I thought his voice that he chose for Randall Flagg really just seemed to fit. He came across as actually kind of charismatic and charming from my perspective. And again, we haven't seen much of him yet, but his speech, I thought that it was convincing why someone in this situation would find it appealing. Of course, played by Nat Wolff, who has done a number of collaborations with Josh Boone, as have other actors in this cast. To me, this episode, he kind of brought to mind Dustin Hoffman's character in Midnight Cowboy, Rizzo. Not that he has anywhere near that level of gravitas, but he did kind of bring to mind that kind of rat-like feral behavior to me. And I think he's giving a decent performance. Again, I think most of the actors here are well cast. I didn't bring this up earlier, but I think Heather Graham did a very good job this episode. At the risk of being accused of being sexist, I thought it was interesting that there is a significant age gap between her and Jovan Adepo, but it was completely convincing to me that these two characters would fall into this love. Well, maybe not love, but they would have an affair in this, pandemic landscape, that they would cling to each other. It seemed completely convincing. And I, on the whole, found her acting pretty convincing. The scene where she's kind of staring off into the rain brought a level of angst that few of the performances so far in this show have, particularly not James Marsden, who just seems altogether too sunny for this situation. I feel like he should be a little bit more brooding, at the risk of coming across as cliched. But overall, this episode, it continues to develop the story. I think that the decision to develop the plot in this kind of circular fashion is kind of inexplicable to me, and it's just not working. I overall just feel that this feels like a very, very sanitized and kind of a shambling version of what Stephen King put together. So if there's one good outcome from this, I've said this before in the comments section, I'll say it here, hopefully it is that people will rediscover Stephen King's novel. I am not the biggest fan of the novel, but I have to agree that it is far, far better than what has been derived from it. So those are just my thoughts for what they're worth. Let me know what you thought in the comments if you're enjoying this show. If you think there were any adaptational changes that really, really frustrated you, let me know in the comments. If you're interested in seeing more upcoming reviews on this channel, such as my upcoming review of American Gods Season 3, please consider subscribing, and if you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.